The Genshin banners have been changed apparently to where starting from 5.3, any new characters will be on the banner for the entirety of the version, meaning that you now have a full 42 days or version to get any new characters that you want. And speaking of the new characters, hello there, sick flip here, and today we're going to be talking about the 5.3 banners. You know the drill by now, make sure to check the pinned comment if there's any updates, but for now the characters announced are Mavuika and Citlali, obviously, alongside Arlecchino and Clorinde. Hello, is this 911? Yes, I'd like to announce a dead man because there's no other explanation for where Risley is. I think every single Fontaine damage dealer has rerun at this point before him. Why? Alas, we're going to be going over the banner characters as well as the weapon banner and just breaking down just how valuable all these things are and if you should pull for them. But before we do that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing as I talk on various topics regarding Genshin's meta and I'll try to keep you updated. Shout out to all my lovely channel members, I appreciate your support, and with that, let's begin. Fuck it, let's just wrap the band-aid off. Let's talk about Mavuika first as her value is very interesting to discuss. Actually, before we even get there, I made a community post talking about how Mavuika is objectively a good unit, even if you dislike her, and for some reason people took me as that defending her kit design, which I'm not. Tomorrow or on Saturday, I'll be releasing my personal problems with her kit, so stick around for that. But for how strong she's going to be, I will discuss that now. Mavuika is a 5-star Pyro unit who has two parts to her kit, where she can either be an on-field damage dealer, or she can have a more off-field oriented playstyle, primarily doing off-field damage, being able to utilize the scroll set if there's no other wielder, and applying Pyro. She's all around a unit you can't really go wrong with, because if you pull for her, you get one of the strongest on-field damage dealers in the game, and the current best Pyro DPS in my opinion due to the extreme amount of quality of life in her kit. For starters, she has no energy requirement and her burst is tied to a mechanic called Fighting Spirit that is enabled by your team's consumption of Night Soul points or normal attacks. So you just need to pair her with Natlan supports, and you are set. She has an extreme amount of front load from her burst, especially if you're able to vaporize or melt it. And then after this massive initial hit, her damage can be sustained through her charge attacks. She has a decent amount of flexibility in teammates as a damage dealer, she has great AoE, infinite interruption resistance in her burst form, and she doesn't require any cancels or combos as her optimal playstyle to get the highest amount of damage is doing donuts by charge attack spamming, making her about as brainless to play as Nouveau Light, you just don't get his range or self-healing or massive HP pool. On top of this, her damage is just as high if not higher than the other current Pyro damage dealers. Her rotations are just a bit longer to compensate as characters like Linny or Arlecchino run 16 to 18 second rotations depending on the supports, where Mavuika can potentially run 18 second rotations, but more realistically it's around 22 seconds. Basically what I'm trying to say is that she's one of the best on-field damage dealers. And that is only one part of her kit, the other part allows you to be a pseudo Shangling, applying Pyro once every 2 seconds. And her burst also gives you a decaying damage bonus of up to 50% to the on-field character. Mavuika fixes the biggest issue people have with support Xiangling to where she doesn't have a need to build energy, on top of having a lot higher personal damage than a support Xiangling. This is because Mavuika can allocate all of her stats to offense while giving herself attack, and then you have her burst, which is a nuclear hit which can be vaped or Bennett buffed. So whenever you don't need a tremendous amount of Pyro application, Mavuika is just a better supportive Xiangling. But I'm going to use the word support very loosely because without the scroll set, which is very highly contested by someone like Xilonen, Mavuika barely supports, and most of the reason why a team's damage output is increased is just because Mavuika does double Xiangling's damage on these teams, even when being played primarily off field. So if you're looking for an upgrade to some of your Knight, Risley, Clorinde, Ganyu melt teams, essentially any team that uses a support Xiangling, then Mavuika is going to be someone worth looking into getting. She can actually be used decently with Chaska on double Pyro teams, again mostly due to her high damage output, not that she does anything for Chaska. If you were pulling in this patch for a Chaska upgrade, then I'd point you over to Citlali. And for Mualani, she also isn't that spectacular with her for a plethora of reasons that I will dedicate an entire video to because people seemed very angry when I said that. Regardless, she is still one of the strongest on and off-field damage dealers in the game, while being a strong enough Xiangling replacement on a few teams to where it's hard to find accounts that wouldn't like her. The only thing that comes to mind for people that should skip her is if you don't have Xilonen, as you then need to rely on having Auroron and Chevreuse to make really competent DPS teams, or try and snipe Citlali in the other banner. And also if you have teams that just don't care for a Pyro off-fielder, then again there isn't much value to having Mavuika in that case, as Pyro can be a very intrusive reaction to add universally, unlike something like Hydro. So if you happen to fall into both or one of these categories, feel free to skip her I guess. Let's move on. Now for Granny Eatsley, she's a lot more straightforward to recommend as she explicitly only works with a few units. Citlali is a cryo character that is focused around buffing Pyro and Hydro damage, and she doesn't do much else, but thankfully she works for a majority of Pyro and Hydro damage dealers, and still has some use cases outside of that. Now for if you should pull her, if you're a Chaska main, she just enables her best team, replacing Auroron, giving you defensive utility and enabling forward melts. Citlali is able to reduce both Pyro and Hydro resistances by virtue of just existing basically, so she's one of the only ways to get multiple different elements shredded for Chaska. The next biggest winner of the Gilf is going to be Pyro mains. So if you play Mavuika or Arlecchino or any Pyro damage dealer that isn't a fast applicators like the ones on screen, you are able to play forward melt teams with a second cryo unit with just skills higher than vape teams, and is able to frontload a lot more damage, while being able to benefit from cryo resonance. Mavuika uniquely should be able to also run solo Citlali alongside Clorinde, and as long as you're able to melt Mavuika's burst and just like one or two of her charge attacks, the damage you gain is so ridiculous to where it still ends up being her best DPS team currently, even when not melting a lot of your hits. Her initial burst hit melted is just that much damage. You can also play vape melt teams with pyro carries. The principle behind these teams is that since Citlali isn't able to enable forward melts by herself, if you bring a Hydra character, then when you don't melt you will still vape instead, and when cryo is applied, enemies will be frozen so you're able to melt off of that. This would allow the faster pyro applicators like Hu Tao and Linny to not have their vape consistency ruined, while still benefiting from occasional melts. And while this is all fine and dandy, I'm never really going to recommend this team, purely for the fact that this interaction not only doesn't work against bosses, but actively makes your teams worse. Most bosses in Genshin can't be frozen, however you will still trigger their freeze reaction, and it will take away both your Hydro and Cryo aura. This makes it very easy to apply Pyro and miss out on vaping or melting your big hits, just tanking your team's damage output. This leads me to not really want to recommend someone like Hu Tao with Citlali, as Hu Tao's damage is really predicated on being able to vape all your charge attacks. But for Linny, he has higher unreacted damage, so even without vaping or melting, Citlali teams will still be relative to all his other strong teams. I think it's very valuable that for Pyro carries, Citlali is able to offset a Clorinde or Kaza for your other team, kind of like what Chevreuse does but a lot less restricted. And if you play double cryo team, she's also able to completely offset the need for a Hydra unit as well, which is massive for being able to open up more teams on your second half. The last characters that can benefit from Citlali are Hydra units. You either get Nouvelette's best shielded team or another option for Mualani setups. Hydra units can't really do multiplicative reactions off of cryo, so there isn't a strong reason to use on-field Hydra units with Citlali when Clorinde and Kazuha exist who just amplify them more, so that's about it for her use cases with Hydra units. So to pretty much summarize, Chaska main should really consider pulling, and so should any Pyro main besides like Hu Tao mains, as you won't get that much of an impact. A Genshin impact! I'm so sorry. Citlali does also have really funny teams like using her on Kinich, but for what is meta relevant, again, Chaska, Pyro damage dealers, anyone else can freely skip her. Speaking of Pyro damage dealers, we can now talk about Arlecchino actually. Oh my god, from a purely meta standpoint, if you want a Pyro DPS, then Mavuika is just the better choice, assuming you have Clorinde, which I'd assume most people do. Recommending Pyro damage dealers in general is going to be very hard when Mavuika exists, and just deals more damage than all of them with the same teammates, while having the least amount of gameplay issues, on top of being able to have some decent supportive capabilities. How greedy! Though at the same time, Mavuika being really good doesn't suddenly make Arlecchino unable to clear or a bad character. That is just not how that works. As long as you're within the top tier DPS bracket, you really can't go wrong with picking one up, in which Arlecchino definitely falls into that category. There's a reason why people have been arguing that she's a top 3 DPS since her release, so if you like Arlecchino's playstyle and don't care about Mavuika's supportive utility, or the fact that she's easier to play, does more damage, has a bigger nuke, can be healed, if you don't care about all those things, go ahead and pull for her. She's still an excellent damage dealer. She also has an insane amount of team flexibility in Chevreuse, vape teams, melt, monopyro, double geo, burning, and so on, and there are even some non-Bennett teams that I really like. As long as you have Bennett or Chevreuse, you're really good to go. Now let's talk about my GOAT Clorinde. Clorinde is a great character and I'm tired of people pretending that she's not. But I can somewhat understand why people underrate her. In comparison to other DPS units, or at least the popular ones, the reason why Clorinde gets overlooked is mostly due to the fact that if you don't have things like her 5-star weapon, or some Constellations, her raw personal damage just doesn't reach the levels of other carries. So if you try to play her in things like hyper carry setups, she may feel underwhelming. But the main problem with this is the fact that Clorinde is an amazing utilizer of off-field damage dealers that contribute more to the team's overall damage output than they do for other carries, mainly Fischl and Auroron. This has not been a very pleasant week, if you can't tell. I really should Google this, but when you blow your nose, is it supposed to bleed? Anyways, if you look at an Arlecchino vape team for example, Yelan most likely has to run a Favonius weapon and an ER Sands to burst every rotation, reducing her damage output by a lot. In fact, with Clorinde on the team, she doesn't even get buffed by scroll. And if you compare that to something like Fischl on an aggravate team or Aurora on electrocharged, to where they can make up a decent majority of the team's damage, I would go as far as to say that Clorinde's numbers are balanced around this, because if she did as much damage as Mualani or Arlecchino, then her teams just wouldn't be fair, as she can add an off-field damage dealer dealers that just do more damage than what other DPS get, and I think that's the direction Hoyoverse is going in with Electro units. Anyways, I'm yapping, I'll talk more about it when her rerun comes around. My point is that building your off-field damage dealers for her is very important, compared to other carries that make up a greater majority of their team's damage. So if you only have Clorinde well invested and not the rest of your team, she may feel underwhelming, compared to other DPS. And even though her potential damage ceiling is lower, she still has a ton of gameplay upsides, like her self-healing, the fact that she gets infinite interruption resistance while in her skill lunge, and that attack also allows you to reposition very quickly. And while she doesn't have the range of Nouvelette, she still has the same cone-shaped AoE hitbox, allowing her to line up enemies like bowling pins. Some other DPS units just don't have AoE without Kazuha, and thankfully Clorinde isn't one of them. Her team diversity is also some of the best, and for an attack scaler, she really just doesn't utilize Bennett often. Clorinde's best teams are going to be Chevreuse, Aggravate, Electrocharged, Quick Burn, Shallonen Double Geo, and Quick Bloom. And if you do get her signature or Constellations, you can run more hyper-focused variants of these teams, replacing her off-field damage dealers for a buffer like Sara. So overall, while I do think Clorinde is the weakest damage dealer here out of Mavuika and Arlecchino, she still has very big positives in her quality of life, teammate diversity, and AoE. So I do think she's a character most people should give a second glance at. In conclusion, if I were to rank all 4 characters, I think that Mavuika and Citlali are honestly pretty equal in value, Mavuika being a stronger DPS than everyone here whilst having strong off-field capabilities. But if you don't think you need another DPS and are only looking at her off-field capabilities, then you honestly aren't losing much, as she's only a buff to a handful of units, while not really creating team archetypes the same way Archons like Furina or Nahida did. And then for Citlali, she can either be the most or least valuable if you're playing Chaska or the Pyro carries I listed prior, but if you just don't have the character she works well with, then she offers no value to you, which is why it depends. Then for the 2 carries, Arlecchino and Clorinde being purely DPS units does inherently make them lose value, especially if you already have good ones. However, if you feel like you're lacking a good carry option, then I'm personally more inclined to recommend Clorinde at this stage. Not because I think she's better, but just because since Mavuika isn't Bennett power creep, most of the damage dealers in this game are tied to Bennett at the hip, and Clorinde isn't really one of them. Her best teams in Aggravate, Electrocharged, and Overload don't even utilize him at all, so there's just less competition for what you can use on your other half compared to Arlecchino. He would just fight for your Bennett slot. All in all, you can't really go wrong on this banner. Every character here is very strong, surprisingly. So with the character banners covered, let's talk about the weapon banners, in which I'll both talk about the weapons and early constellations of the characters. Starting with Mavuika and Citlali's signatures, it's of course going to be both their best in slots. Focusing first on my wife's weapon, it essentially just gives the active character a 28% damage bonus when you create a shield for 15 seconds, as well as being an elemental mastery stat stick for the wielder. Imagine Shalonen's signature weapon but just on Citlali, that's essentially it. I wouldn't personally recommend going for the weapon just because if you have to choose a vertical investment path, her Constellation 1 is just better, which essentially gives you Shenhe Quills that scale off of Citlali's EM. You start with 10 at a base but should be able to build up 16 through triggering melts or freezes, and these only apply to the active character so they can't get stolen by off-field units. And this will lead into her C2, which is ludicrous. It will give characters protected by her shield's 250 elemental mastery, as well as making her shred 40% resistances instead of 20%. So for Citlali, you should really just get her Constellations, they're better. Someone commented asking if her weapon was going to be good for a DPS Yanfei, as she generates herself a shield at C4, and after calculating it, for non-Furina teams it is going to be her best weapon. Widsith is technically better, but it's cringe, so do with this information what you will. This is why you should leave comments, by the way, I do look at them. Now for Mavuika, her weapon has high base attack and low crit rate, and the weapon gives crit damage and attack percent after using a skill or burst, which at a base lasts for 6 seconds but can be extended when you do elemental normal attacks or charge attacks, because fuck Eula. And if you're in a Night Soul Blessing, the buffs are enhanced. For Mavuika, this is her best weapon by quite a big margin. Clouds found in sky. You should really just expect this by now with the Natlan characters. But if you're asking whether you should get this over her C1, it depends. As always, Mavuika's C1 increases her Night Soul point cap by 50%, which means that she will get 3 more off-field skill hits, and it will last a total of 18 seconds instead of 12. This is just nice quality of life, I guess. But the big thing is that Fighting Spirit is gained 25% more efficiently, allowing Mavuika to fully funnel her own burst if you meet the minimum requirements if you play her off-field. Her DPS teams are still going to be quite strict as you just consume less of her own Night Soul, so you will still have to bring a Natlan teammate for that. She also gains 40% attack after gaining fighting spirit, which will be active almost always. In terms of an on-field damage increase, it isn't that impactful due to the fact that you don't benefit from the additional skill hits or the extra fighting spirit if you're already playing a Shallonen team, so it's just a 14% attack buff, which is still a decent bump. The biggest thing about her C1 though is the fact that it leads to her C2, which is potentially the biggest single quad increase in the game for an on-field damage dealer. It is ludicrous to both her off or on-field playstyle. It gives her 300 base attack while she's in her Nightsoul Blessing state, which is always active, even while not on the field. And then you either have your damage just hyper buffed by her attack, if she's on her bike, or if she's using her off-field form, then enemies' defenses get reduced by 20% instead. Trying to pick up her early Constellations is just a better vertical investment path. Besides Mavuika though, the weapon is just very good in general. It's very good on Knight, and besides that is equal to a refined 1 max stack Serpent Spine, and it is a decent margin better on Bennetless teams. So if you have a low refined Serpent Spine or find it cringe, then it can be worth picking up. For the next set of weapon banners, which would be Absolution and Crimson Moon something, I don't get paid enough to remember these names. Starting with Arlecchino, here are the damage comparisons. C1 is just a bigger damage increase if you're not on a 5-star weapon, while also giving you interruption resistance when you do normal attacks. You should always prioritize it in my opinion over getting her weapon. Although her weapon does give her drip, that is a very valid reason for pulling. And then for Clorinde, both her weapon and Constellation 1 are just damage increases that don't offer any quality of life benefits. If you don't have a 5-star weapon for her, then go for it. That's about it. But with that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment what banners you're going to be pulling on in 5.3, as I would love to hear it and I respond to almost every single comment. Channel members, I love you and I appreciate your support. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.